My goodness, I feel like I'm teaching a class. Thank you so much, everyone. Good evening and welcome. I'm Andrew Westover, the Eleanor McDonald Storza Director of Education here at the High Museum of Art, and I want to thank you for joining us for tonight's conversation entitled Artists on Nature, Seeing Refuge. Tonight's program is in conjunction with the exhibition Joseph Stella, Visionary Nature, which was co-organized by the High Museum of Art and the Brandywine River Museum of Art. This exhibition was made possible by funding from our exhibition series donors, Delta Airlines, Premier Exhibition Series supporters, ACT Foundation, William N. Banks, Cousins Foundation, Burton M. Gold, Sarah and Jim Kennedy, Harry Norman Realtors, and of course the Wish Foundation. And before I begin, I would like to first thank the High Museum members who are in attendance tonight. I know many of you are. Your support is invaluable and fuels our mission. And if you're not yet a member or need to renew, you are welcome to visit high.org at the end of the program in order to do so. I'd also like to thank staff members Noah Schmitz and John Voorhees and the full High team for their help making tonight's program happen. So, tonight we're here to hear from three excellent speakers. So before we begin, I'll give just a quick rundown of their biographies, which you also can access via the event page online. Tonight's speakers, artist Reverend Houston Cypress, artist Charmaine Minniefield, and curator Stephanie Heydt. Charmaine Minniefield is an artist and activist who lives and works here in Atlanta. Firmly rooted in womanist social theory and ancestral veneration, Minnefield's work draws from indigenous traditions as seen throughout Africa and the diaspora to explore African and African American history, memory, and ritual as an intentional pushback against erasure. Her creative practice is community-based, and her research and resulting bodies of work often draw from public archives. She was awarded the National Endowment for the Arts Our Town grant to present her Praise House project at 3 different locations in Metro Atlanta to celebrate African American history of those communities. And her most recent exhibition, Indigo Prayers, A Creation Story, in 2022, was presented at the Michael C. Carlos Museum at Emory University. Reverend Houston R. Cypress is a Two-Spirit artist and environmentalist from the Otter clan of the Muskogee tribe who lives and works in Miami, Florida. He serves as the Muskogee, I'm mispronouncing the name of your tribe, I apologize. Migosuki, thank you, tribe's Environmental Advisory Committee, and has spent the past decade working with Love the Everglades movement, an environmental nonprofit concerned with indigenous solidarity, multi-faith coalition building, and reciprocity with nature. He embraces poetry as a foundation of his artistic and spiritual practices, including his audiovisual work. His recent artist residencies include the Heat Exchange, the Thread Residency, the Oolite Art Studio Residency, and the Ringling HAT Residency. In 2022, he received the Grassroots Activism Award, the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas Poetry Award, and, importantly, the Oolite Arts Ellie's Social Justice Award. He also recently helped to produce the first Two-Spirit LGBTQ+ Pride Festival on these ancestral homelands. And last but certainly not least, the co-curator of the exhibition that this is all stemming from, Dr. Stephanie Heydt is the High's esteemed Margaret and Terry Stent Curator of American Art. Before coming to the High, you may already know that she worked at the Gulf Coast Museum of Art in Largo, Florida, and in the American Art Department at Harvard Art Museums, as well as at the Terra Foundation for American Art in Chicago. She has written for numerous exhibition and collection catalogs, including at the High, Simple Pleasures, Still Life in American Art, Something Over Something Else, Romar Bearden's Profile Series, and of course, Joseph Stella, Visionary Nature, among others. So first, please join me in welcoming these 3 esteemed panelists. Thank you so much. And I'm playing tech person here. Hopefully this now has gotten to the next slide. Wonderful. Big relief of the night. Now I'd like to welcome Stephanie, to begin with the presentations. Each will now give about their individual work, and then we'll open to a broader conversation between all three. Stephanie.
Thank you, Andrew, and also to Noah for all of your help with this discussion and pulling these two amazing artists together with me in conversation about their practice and the practice of an artist who couldn't be with us today, Joseph Stella. So I stand in for him. I'm really excited about this exhibition. When I work on these exhibitions, it's like taking a journey back in time. I can't mind read. I can't really ever pull up exactly what the artist was thinking. But one element I hope that comes through in the show, if you've seen it in person, and if not, I'll just point your attention to it along the way. I have probably more than enough slides that will help do that today. I'll move quickly though. Is that Stella did make his voice known. He did leave many writings and a lot of interpretation about his approach to art. A lot of it was retrospective, so done looking back at his life and making comments, but still very helpful for us in interpreting his art in many ways. What he didn't leave was a connect the dots for us in any sense of the of things, I guess. He did not tell us how to engage with, interpret, or understand his paintings, which actually I think adds to your potential to really take something away from the experience of standing in front of them. So the exhibition, we are the second venue, but we are a co-organizer, and it's the biggest presentation of the exhibition here at the museum. And because my colleagues aren't here from the other institutions, probably the best in my mind. And again, because what we did here was add Stella's voice. Every text panel includes a quote that he made or said, and every room includes his own words on the walls. And then if you've been through the exhibition, at the end, we've assembled many of his quotes and words together as actually a video experience. But very quickly, if you're not aware of Stella, that's okay. A little brief primer here on him. Born in 1877, arrives in the United States at the age 18/19. There's some debate, but he's already, a young man. He's never had formal art education, but is given permission to pursue art school briefly, and briefly is only because he decided that being told what to do at art school was not for him. But he had a natural talent and ability that people did recognize. And I put these two slides up because they're the two earliest works of the show, and they're also what you encounter first in the exhibition, because they're also in some ways very telling of things that do interest Stella over time. The first is the portrait. You'll never see another traditional picture in the whole rest of the show like this, but I show it because he's emulating the teachers that he was working with at the time and the styles that were common and popular. And this is, he was a student of an artist named William Merritt Chase, who was an American Impressionist who revered the old masters from the northern parts of Europe. And here you can see him sort of looking at Rembrandt and looking at probably more specifically like Franz Hals and this sort of dark on dark approach. And just hold on to that idea of the old masters being important to Stella. The other early picture here is this fragment of from tree bark. And it's just, cut out from a piece of paper, almost looks like a scrap, except that he signed and dated it. It's from 1900, and it's just exquisite. You get up close, and it's like the amount of time he spent developing the texture on this tiny, humble little fragment. These are themes that persist with Stella throughout. This close look at pieces from the larger whole are very interesting to him, and how nature presents so many ways of exploring, of exploring it and themes is really fascinating to him. So now I'm going to breeze through a bunch of slides just to give you a sense for the range of Stella's work and interest. and then also to remind you of the theme that really does persist for him. This is another early work. It looks like it could have been made by the hand of Rembrandt. It's an etching. It's very rich, and it's got a lot of texture to it. And it's also a format in the way that he represents trees, which is a recurring theme for him. He just is always returning to trees. And also, we start to imagine that trees, for him, and we have evidence of this, are actually, he identifies with, and he finds himself in trees. They become, in a sense, self-portraits. But he very often focuses on just a fraction of the tree, a portion of the tree, not the whole tree, the trunk, and then shows its extending branches and arms, always heading off the picture plane in really, I think, interesting ways. He says about himself in an interview later in life that he always wanted to fall in at the height of his powers, like an oak struck by lightning. So he imagined these trees as just like strong and powerful. And I would have to say that's probably how he also thought of himself. And just again, another sense for the range of his work. This happens to be a really beautiful charcoal drawing. If you can believe it, it's actually a picture that is about the degraded work conditions that coal miners had to face in eastern western Pennsylvania. But even in something like this, he's finding this way of bringing nature in. It almost shrouds this industrial scene in a way that's almost brings a sense of beauty or otherworldliness to his work. So he starts developing this language around nature, and the picture I'm so bad with right and left when it's all reversed. Okay, on this side, the right side, you're right. He's working with tropical plants. On the left, you would think he made them maybe on the same day. He's painting a gas tank, and you can see the integrated language that he's developing between the urban and the nature subjects that he's choosing. I call this section American landscape. Those are his words. He starts painting American industrial scenes, but he calls them landscapes, which again, he's infusing nature into so many of, just his approach to the world. These are very faint and maybe hard to see, so another reason to go up and see the show if you haven't. He takes on the process of silver point, pardon me, I have a little brain moment there. He revives it. He's part of a group of artists who revive it in the early 1900s, and it's a traditional technique that he explored that was practiced by Renaissance artists. So another connection to his ancestral traditions, to the Italian traditions he was interested in, and he uses this technique to look very closely at flowers. He started regularly visiting the botanical gardens as a retreat from daily life in New York, which was beginning to sort of weigh down on him. He was always complaining about how dark and sad the city was, and that the botanical gardens gave him a sense of relief and a place to run to. And that his time in the botanical gardens and his exploration of these old master techniques as well really accumulated within him a body, like a sense for what his mission was. And it really comes out in this first major work that announces his interest in nature, which he paints in 1920. So he's already well into his career, but he sort of shifts gears. He's always painting nature, but his focus had been the American city. And then he has this epiphany. And I'll read it here. It says, "One clear morning in April, I found myself in the midst of joyous singing and delicious scent, ready to celebrate the baptism of my new art, the birds and the flowers already bejeweling the tender foliage of the newborn tree of my hopes, the tree of my life, the dawn of a new era." So this is what he's imagining for the next chapter in his career, which is all about nature and his origins, actually. I'll point out some details in a minute, but he's thinking back to Italy. The other thing that inspired this painting was wandering through Brooklyn, and he was painting the Brooklyn Bridge, and here is the famous painting that really, solidified who Stella was and how people understood him to be, the painting on the far side on the left. He was painting the Brooklyn Bridge, and you can see it's all dark and nocturnal. And he's taking walks around the Brooklyn neighborhood, and he sees this little tree trying to poke up through the cracks in the sidewalk. And he identifies with this tree. This tree is trying to survive against all the odds. And so he paints Tree of My Life as an homage to that. The tree becomes actually in Tree of My Life, it's an olive tree, the kind that you would find in Italy. And so that's one self-reference. But also, you can see, if you get up close, it's kind of hard on the smaller screen, references to the places that were important to him, like the botanical gardens, if you imagine looking up through the glass ceilings of the conservatory. You can see here references to his town, Morlucano, where he grew up in Italy. And then flowers, birds, all the themes that start filling his world are really, they're announced in this painting, and you can find almost everything that shows up in the rest of the show embedded somehow in this painting. So the herons, the butterflies, the gorgeous, we have a whole room of just gorgeous pastels in there. Pastels are really hard to borrow from other institutions because they are so fragile. And this is just a special moment that we have, so many of them on view, and it was a special medium that he really enjoyed and was so, loved to explore the ethereal effects of nature with this particular pastel. He's inspired then to go back to Italy. He's made one visit. World War I comes along. He can't go back to Europe, and he finally goes back in 1922. And he just leans into to the Italian subject matter, to subjects that remind him of his history. He spends time in Morlucano, where he's from, and then also in Naples. And you can see the persistence of the Bay of Naples. Vesuvius appears again and again. And then also this reference to his interest in his own spiritual upbringing. He was raised as a Catholic, and this begins to present itself in his art. And then also to his traditions and to the traditional art, not the Raphaels of the old masters, but rather the vernacular and folk traditions of art that he would have been familiar with from as a youth. So you can see some of the idols that would have been paraded through town that he's referencing very directly in this painting, Purissima, which is in the Hayes collection, and the joy that he's trying to communicate and convey through these bright colors and beautiful surrounds, this almost beginnings of a cathedral of nature, an altarpiece, if you will, of this beautiful Madonna figure surrounded by nature. He's looking again to the old masters always, and these are just one of the inspirations that he writes about, the Duke and Duchess of Urbino and the Profile series, but making his own mark on it, right? There's always some element of nature sort of inserted into his portraiture. The Amazonian woman, for example, is actually a friend of his, a writer, Catherine Millet, and she's represented hovering over the Bay of Naples as an Amazonian princess, and it's just a very sort of inspired approach. No limits, no rules. He's making up his own world, really, in his art. He writes at some point that it's my devout wish that every working day might begin and end as a good omen with the light, gay painting of a flower. And he really does follow this. There's a whole section on flowers and his sort of devotion to floral representation. And then towards the end of his life, a visit to Barbados, where again, he's fascinated with the landscape, with the beauty that the island offered. It was so different than anything he had ever seen before. and becomes really interested, of course, in this one particular tree, factors again and again in his representations on the island. And then finally, the end of his life, which was actually a little sad. He has some health issues, has a heart attack, falls down an elevator shaft. He's partially blind. He's not able to leave his studio. And this is when he writes, "May every day begin with the gay and light painting of a flower." Flowers and nature still are providing him with sustenance, with the ability to sort of get up every day and start something anew. And one of his close friends, who was a successful artist, came to visit his studio and wrote about it, and said that, you would walk in and it was just everything everywhere, just papers on the floor, drawings, everything. And in the center of the room was Stella at his easel with, a paper crayon, maybe a silver point tipped instrument, making a drawing, finishing up the last detail on a tulip, totally unaware of the chaos in his studio. And you looked around, and it was like you were walking through a garden, because there are just flowers everywhere. Not actual flowers, but his pictures of them. So this is how he sustained himself. And then lastly, when you go see the show, we did want to leave Stella with the last word. So we have, I think, a wonderful video that is just very poetic, and just him talking about his art, his point of view about, nature and the world. So I find this might be a nice way to bring, art of 100 years ago to artists who are today practicing in using nature and history and ancestors to think about their current existence. So I don't know who's next. Oh, Charmaine, okay. So thank you. There's Stella.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. What a pleasure to see you all this evening. I want to first acknowledge the land that we're on as Muskogee land, and give a moment in honor of those who have served the land, those ancestors who received us when we arrived to these parts, in honor of them. I'm going to remember my great-grandmother's name. I invite you to think of your own ancestor in this moment, as I do. Oralee Fuqua is my great-grandmother. She was born in Central City, Kentucky. Her family before her in Tennessee. Their family from Fuqua, Varina, our first forced settlement to these parts. My work recalls her memories. I knew her. She had a garden. She was a healer. And she was who I called on in my prayers when I was recently stranded in the Gambia during quarantine and was forced into an unexpected artist residency. After George Floyd, I prayed to her and said, "What do we do in the worst of times?" And she said, "We pray." She reminded me of the memories of prayer that moved through my body. They were her memories of freedom. The ring shout. The ring shout is a traditional worship and gathering practice that was born in the West in resistance to laws intended to dismantle community. They took our drums. We could not communicate. So we made praise houses, and the floors of those praise houses were our communal drum. The structure was an instrument. We tuned the room with our voice. We found community in circle. We stood in circle and moved in circle as a community. and sang in call and response. I've been recalling this prayer, this memory of freedom in community in Atlanta. Some of you all might have heard of the Praise House Project. It is a manifestation of my prayers to recall freedom in community with you all by inviting historic preservation and memory back into all of our bodies together. There's medicine in movement, my grandmother reminded me. Medicine in movement. The ring shout was medicine. Was medicine. What is the other medicine that we're forgetting in community? What are we recalling together in community? While in the Gambia, I invited the memories of my ancestors into my body, and I began to record myself in movement in this prayer that I had been taught by my great-grandmother, that she had used as the container of memories from Africa. And I also invited my ancestors in by painting in indigo. So I sought out indigenous medium and painted in that voice while I was there in the Gambia, self-portraits of myself dancing the ring shout in indigo. Indigo prayers. Each image was a principle that my grandmother would pray that she would pass on, and I'm passing on in community. Does that make sense? Yes. Abundance, sovereignty, wisdom. Allow us to preserve our sacred sites. Wisdom. Love, peace, eternal, forever. Nature, sanctuary, refuge. When we arrived, it looked like home. And I believe that the land received us and made refuge for us. Hush harbors were low sitting land where trees would grow high and we would gather in the safety of their shelter. And we would perform the ring shout. Before we had the means to erect a praise house, we gathered in hush harbors, the land. When I was in the Gambia, someone told me, we used to bury our ancestors in the tree trunks of baobabs. All of this is a map for me. It's a map through identity, through memories, taking me home. Recalling those memories all around me, my grandmother's garden, the sweetness of her tomatoes, I recall them. Still the call and response, still the rhythm of the drum through the floors of our tree, a container of our memories, praise houses that we made ourselves to recall freedom. So it's an honor to recall these memories with you in community and to think that I'm at the High Museum. You know, it's an honor. And I feel that all of this is a journey home. Our identity is the map. Thank you.
Hemonita HMG Hopelia Lahir picture to Miss Jinti Monepec, Inhiatok, Inhang Lepec, La Atamach Message, Yawata. It's really an honor to be with you here tonight, to hear your stories, to share in this sense of joy, and to get to know you. And so I want to say thank you very much for the honor to be here with you all. I wanted to make sure my alarm doesn't go off. And so I come from the watershed that's known as the Kissimmee-Okeechobee Everglades watershed. And when we talk about these places back home, we like to remind folks that it's the greater Everglades that we're talking about. Because when people come and visit this place that I call home in South Florida at the southern tip of the Florida Peninsula, people think of it as just a national park, but it's a lot more than that. And as an indigenous person, my ancestry really embraces the southeast region of this continent. So I like to include that origin story of my people in the storytelling that I do and the interpretation that I do. And so I want to make sure that I'm showing the right images too. Okay. All right, am I going back or forward? Okay. Okay.
An easy way is to just.
Here we are. Yeah. So these are some images from back home that I'm talking about. And the kind of work that I'm doing lately has been coming under the umbrella of the nonprofit that's known as the Love the Everglades movement. And I like to advocate for a watershed-wide notion of restoration, but we don't really like to use the word restoration back home. We like to use the phrase healing of the land. So when I started this project a number of years ago with my buddy, we had a dare that we proposed to each other because we had spent a couple years telling the stories of the Miccosukee elders, and we were really moved by what my community was saying, and he was really called to action. So the double dare that we proposed to each other was, how can we get people to care about a place if they've never been there? And also, like, how can we encourage people to give the water the respect it deserves? So over a number of years, we've been doing a lot of different kinds of activities, bringing people together through events and actions. But we also want to do things in a multi-faith and interfaith kind of way. So there's a lot of prayer involved, spiritual activities, and definitely the use of plant medicines, all kinds of plant medicines. When I was growing up, that was something that kept me on the straight and narrow, and I want to make sure that these beautiful plant medicines are available for the next generation. So we're trying to inspire action, but we also want to inspire action with the support of Indigenous leadership. So we wanted to be a model for Indigenous solidarity in the region. And we're trying to let people know that we're always already connected to these Everglades because the water of the lands, it flows through our lives, it flows through our communities. It's pumped up from the aquifers, and it's also flowing through our bodies as well. Whether it's in our communities, in our drinking water, in the foods that we cook, it flows through our bodies. And the waters that flow across the land also flow into the cooling ponds of our nuclear power plants. So when we're using our energy, it implicates us, it integrates us into the societies of the living stories of the Everglades. So when we're out here on the land, we like to think about what kind of energy, what kind of message are we emitting out there? We want to bring people together for positive actions. We don't really think of the kind of actions that we do as protesting because we don't really want to send an energy of anger or hatred across the land because the land is a meme replicator. The land will amplify what we emit out there. So in terms of sustenance, in terms of sustainability, what is it? What kind of traditions do we want to endure? Is it a respectful relationship with the land? Is it traditional farming practices? Hunting, ceremony? So what we're trying to do out there is we're creating a forum a forum for collaboration, for the kind of artwork that embraces multiple voices, and overall, we're becoming a full spectrum movement advocating for the integrity of the circle of life. So, some of the things that we're doing here in terms of ceremony and multi-faith and interfaith can be shamanistic. It definitely embraces multiple voices, multiple traditions, and I think that we can do these kind of prayers and ceremonies wherever we find ourselves. And so, deep listening becomes the direct action. And I think that somewhere along the line, we're starting to explore the idea of what is a chosen family. And so, these are some of the ideas that I just wanted to bring seeds for you to kind of think about. There's a lot more that I want to have in conversation with my friends here, but I wanted to show you who we are, the kinds of things that inspire us, and what we're trying to inspire in the community of people that we care for. Because the living stories, the stories that are embedded on the land, continue to speak to us, continue to call out to us. And when we're doing these actions out there, it's really about deep listening. Sometimes we talk, sometimes we walk, but it's really about listening to the land and using our imagination, our intuition, to really interpret what nature is telling us. So I want to have a conversation with my friends here, and I also want to have a conversation with you too, because we're all conspirators here. We're all breathing the same air on this land together. So I just wanted to offer some ideas, offer some images of the kind of places that we care for back home. And I want you to know that you're always invited. The door, like the heart, is always open. So let's have a conversation. Let's talk about these things. Let's explore. And I want to say thank you. Shuna Bisha.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. So at this point, you may be wondering, what conversation have I wandered into? We've got three very clear perspectives and three people who are clearly thinking about nature and three people who are artists. But beyond that, what do we have going on? So before we launch into our first question, just a little bit more of the texture that we're seeing in and through these conversations that'll help guide us as we move forward. You know, when Stephanie and I were having initial conversations about this exhibition, a lot of it was thinking about, who is Stella the person? We don't know that much. We see the art, we see this devotion to land and nature that Stephanie illuminated so well, and two, this sense of spirituality being deeply connected to artistic practice, but also something that it isn't a one-to-one. He's not out here marching to, for example, the beat of a Catholic drum per se. And we start to see this sort of fluidity in the way spirituality is held, in the way nature is held, even in the way his relationships are with other people, that I think is honestly a little bit ahead of his time or maybe out of the bounds of time. And that's where I think we start to see the connections with some of Charmaine's work, where there's this real understanding that who we are is deeply connected to people who come before and to people who will come after. And so while for Stella, it was so much about his Italianness, and then his displaced sense of being in the US, and then back in Italy, and then in Barbados, for Charmaine, it's this, I am the product of so much more than my own life, and then to display that in the work that I create and generate, which I then see as we move forward into Houston's work, as something that extends in this incredible way to people, communities, and land. We've got this really nuanced impression of, in your case, the Everglades, and this, a place where water is such a defining feature, but it's not merely a thing, it's a life expression in and of itself. And so there's this beautiful tension, I think, that we can find here between three very distinct artistic practices and a real connection to thinking about nature and its possibility. nature can hold much more than what we observe. And what I think each of these artists provide for us are windows into ways nature can be more than just what we see. So my first question on this lane, sorry, mini sermon, done,
Did it?
is
Come on now.
I would love to know from each of you just when you think about nature, and you're in the hard seat, Stephanie, because you're speaking as an artist who's not with us and someone who's spent so much time thinking about this artist. But if you can, maybe we'll start with you because yours is the hardest. Congrats. When Stella, in this instance, is thinking about nature, how would you describe Stella's approach to nature? There are lots of examples you've given us. If you could maybe try to synthesize that a bit, how across his work is Stella holding nature? And for each of you, it'll soon be the same question. How do you hold nature?
Did it, right? Did I?
Hello?
Okay.
Hello?
It is hard, Andrew, thank you for acknowledging that. But I did choose the career path that puts me in the position of often having to speak for artists long since deceased. But Stella, I feel like I got to know him a little bit through his writing. And for him, nature was, I don't want to say it was everything, because he really did admire the modernity that he experienced in New York. He came back from Italy after a 3-year excursion between 1909 and 1913, and he arrives, and the Woolworth Building has been erected, and there are all of these advances that are stunning to him and beautiful. But you'll note that most of his pictures of the city and of New York are set at night. They're set under the veil of, the sort of nocturne. He thinks, and so in a way, he's inserting nature there just by the time of day. I mean, it's almost two parts of his life just at different times of the day. The night is occupied by the city, and the day is really his escape from it. So you asked for a short answer. I would say nature becomes his retreat. It becomes the way that he is able to maintain his path through life when he is somewhere he doesn't necessarily connect with. There's always the tree in the park that he can go sit beneath and commune with.
I remember one of the first conversations I had with a woman in the Gambia when I first arrived. She asked where I was from. I told her, and I told her I'm home, and she said, we are all from the same grandmother. And that just, that mother's prayer as a state of truth through time and distance and circumstance brings you all the way back to, our origin stories of interacting with family, community, the earth, our environments. It takes you to those gathering spaces to tell stories. And, family and our connection to each other as human beings, I think is so important in how we center and exist in community today. Where we are inviting our freedom into our bodies and allowing freedom to exist in others. And that act of embodying that memory is meditative and intentional, and the way that my practice takes me there is through nature. I am present in my body. I'm inside of my meditation. I'm surrounded by nature. And I am listening. I'm listening. And I think that that's what Stella was doing, and was also creating a world for himself from that state of freedom and stillness, you know. And that's what we all have, is that sanctuary to go to.
Wow, I really appreciate that last phrase, a world for himself, because in kind of pondering some of the ways that Stella even named some of the artworks that he's created, like thinking of more like the industrial kind of artworks, he refers to those as a landscape. And I think that also reminds me of how we can find ourselves in nature. Not only can we find ourselves in nature, that we're reminded that we are nature, because so much of the use of the color, which kind of blends and kind of like melds into oneself, that spectrum, it reminds me that the land itself is a spectrum. And so we can remind ourselves that we come from the earth, we're going to go back to the earth, and so we are the earth, we're an extension of the earth. And so for me, I really appreciate that sort of like mysticism that is really vibrant and colorful and joyous in so much of the work that is on display here in this exhibit. And it just reminds me that there's this sense of chosen family, right? The chosen family as a survival strategy, whether it's a survival strategy on a personal level, where nature can kind of heal us and give us comfort and the medicine that you've been talking about, whether it's the ancestral lineage, whether it's the lineage of species, that chosen family is a survival strategy. And then just thinking back on our histories as people, indigenous people, people of color, that we needed to embrace each other as family to survive. Like thinking back on my own Miccosukee and Seminole history back home, we had to, and we welcomed and embraced people that were seeking freedom as our families. And so that was a survival strategy at that time. And then just thinking about like people in my community as an LGBTQ person, as a two-spirit person, that's another practice of survival, of chosen family that you can find in the contemporary context. And so like that points to what we need to do to expand our practice of chosen family. We extract already so much. What are we giving back? And I think that when we can claim not only nature as an inspiration, but nature as our friend, nature as our family, I think that just goes to kind of like expand our sense of duty, of joy, of community. So I think even in the joyous way that Stella like uses the colorful palette, I think that just points to a sense of family and community.
I love the way that you all are pointing also to color and the way that shows up here, both to demonstrate a sense of belonging, but also of desire. You know, in these conversations too, I'm interested, and Stephanie, I'm sorry, you get hot seat one more time, but then I promise I'll switch it up. It's interesting too to think about how Stella didn't see himself as a sort of centered, highly privileged person in many ways, largely because, you know, as you all probably remember at the time, someone who's Italian and looks very Italian in the US was actually not considered to be white. And so Stella encountered the realities of living in America when people see you as not white, as part of his lived experience.
Well crafted.
Yeah. Thanks, they pay me for that. And I think I would love to hear from you, as he was considering this relationship with himself, and then also the way color became something that was both demonstrating how he saw. However you want to take that, I would love to hear.
Well, I appreciate that you brought up the question of his identity and where it really placed him in the hierarchy of things in the United States in the early 20th century. He did just fine. He became very central to the art world for a period of time in the 1920s. He was probably one of the most famous artists working in America. People would line up to see him talk, and he had a big presence. He was friends with Marcel Duchamp, and very much at the beginning of the sort of the Dada and Surrealism movement. So he landed, shall we say, but he also, maybe as a point of protest, or just digging his heels into his identity, never let go of his Italian accent, and actually it seemed to grow thicker, people say. He was also always described as having a Vesuvian temper, and a lot of the descriptions of him are sort of framed in the sort of Italian, always about to boil over kind of descriptions. So, but in terms of color, yes, he does live in these, I think, in a way, two worlds that are just one part of a single day. With this all brightness and light is how he sees nature, and it's these almost electric colors that he's using in those spaces. The yellowest of yellows, and he actually he has a, for the lemons and these bright pinks, like the hottest pink that any teenage girl would love to throw on. Like he's painting, his lilies in that color. And he has a whole essay actually about the painting in our collection called Purissima. It's the one I focused on, where she looks like the Madonna image. He writes about it, but he writes really an essay about color. He describes not just the vermilion, but the origins of the vermilion. He describes the colors of the yellow and how you're supposed to feel about those colors. So I find it really magical. His relationship with color is really something that he announces, and he really explores. And not always are these writings shared with people. These are for him in many cases. They're notes and jottings, but they really announce his relationship to color.
Thank you so much. And I know color, too, plays really deeply in your work, Charmaine. I'm going to skip ahead to some of these images towards the end. Maybe if you could speak to how both, you talked about using indigo. Can you speak to this?
Blue has a particular history in African American and African tradition. And I've been on a wave of following blue for years, but that indigenous indigo dye, actually powder, it did activate for me in a certain way. I really appreciate this part of the story of Stella and how he embraced and uplifted the folkloric symbolism of his traditions as almost shrine work that he was creating in his temple of life that he was creating for himself. And I can imagine those also being points of channeling too, for him, channeling memories too. And that's what comes to mind for me about color in the conversation. Yeah.
I appreciate, I think it's for me a sense of of yearning towards a wholeness or an ideal, because there's so much of a contrast between the cityscapes and the industrial kind of work and what happens in nature, and the kind of inspiration that he's drawing from there. But I think that when you take a look at the work as a whole, it's yearning towards some kind of transcendence, and it's so such a beautiful and vivid reaching out towards that. And I think that that's the sort of a unity and it's sort of a mystical tendency that I really appreciate in the sense of color and the kind of compositions that he's so celebrating here in his work.
Thank you all so much. We have just a couple more minutes, so I would like to now open it to questions from the audience. If anyone has a question, if you could go ahead and just raise your hand. Our excellent colleague Noah will have a microphone and guide it.
Or a memory.
Or a memory or a comment. Although I will say, as the institutional voice here, we love comments, and ideally they end with question marks so people can engage with them.
Memories can too.
Yeah, there we go. There we go.
And tell us your name.
Hello. Hi. Yeah. I wonder if you all could talk a little bit more about the water, particularly the Everglades you mentioned and the indigenous support down there in terms of the water. And you mentioned something I'm not quite sure about with the nuclear energy. I didn't quite understand the connection you were trying to make there with the water passing through the...
Sure.
Did you actually mean the nuclear
Because
plant?
when we talk about the water, we like to remind folks that it's not something that is difficult to engage with in terms of water conservation or appreciating how we're using water in different ways, because folks kind of feel disconnected from the natural world because they may live in an urban setting, in a downtown setting, suburban setting. And where I'm from, it might take about 30 to 45 minutes to an hour to get to places like the Everglades from the coastal region. So it's very easy for people to dismiss like a connection with the natural environment and conservation in general. So when we're telling stories, I remind folks that even in the gadgets that we're using, the energy that is generated from these nuclear power plants, they use millions of gallons of water a day to cool the machinery that they have. There's cooling canals. The water goes through these machinery and eventually goes out and is settling on the land. And so water is an integral part of electricity generation, when they're using nuclear power plants and things like that. So when you're charging your gadgets, you're actually using the resources that the aquifer is providing. And so that's what I was referring to, that you may feel disconnected from the natural world, but even with your powerful gadgets and technology, that integrates you in that water cycle already. Yeah. Thank you.
My question is, Charmaine, what are you working on now? And how can we continue this conversation by following and being there too?
I love you, Jill. Thank you. She's planted, you all. She's planted. I love you. I received the National Endowment for the Arts Our Town grant. We're building 3 more praise houses in the Atlanta community. The next one will be at the 1906 Race Massacre site in South Atlanta, and will uplift the Black history of South Atlanta and all civil rights history of Atlanta that rests at Southview Cemetery, right there. The next one will be at Beacon Hill in downtown Decatur, the town that once was downtown Decatur. And the third one will be at Emory University to acknowledge their role in slavery and dispossession. And that will all unfold over the next 2 years. And we're doing community-based programming, inviting artists to remember and recall these histories. And we have a number of projects all over the city happening. But the project is called the Praise House Project. My personal art in all of it is in community, and this is how I work. The installation, the site-specific installation is my art. How it rests in community is my activism. Okay, so that's what's happening. And then I'm also creating art. So that's where the Indigo Prayer series comes from, more art. I have a series that I'm doing at the different locations of my great-grandmother's journey and all the way home. I'm continuing to work in Indigo. And I'm also a digital media artist, so our projection installation and projection mapping work is happening around the city, actually. We have a recent collaboration with Georgia State and did a whole project on the 1906 Race Massacre in downtown through funding, through the Arts and Entertainment Fund. And multiple projects over these 2 years will be digital media, site-specific, large-scale projection installations. We went to Denver for a conference and shared my grandmother's memories there, honored the land first, and told all those public art technology industry folks that we have to hold space in this generation to really affect change. And I've got them all ready to come to Atlanta. So we're talking to folks all across the city, Midtown Arts Alliance, other folks are all hoping that we will host them in 2024 for a conference that will activate projects across the city. And we will project the ring shout, hopefully across the cityscape is what I'm trying to do.
So there's no way to engage with her work at all. There's nothing to do. We are so excited for these
Thank
projects,
y'all for that.
Charmaine.
Thank y'all for that.
Thank you. I'd like to extend the same to each of you.
Yes.
Houston, are there ways if people are interested in following your work or seeing it move forward, how would you recommend people engage or observe or appreciate?
I think that one of the first things I'd like to do is to, again, invite you to come and get familiar with the land. And I think, again, the land, whenever you're out in these places, like the Everglades, like the conversation inevitably turns to healing, to medicine. So feel free to talk to the land, to talk to the plants, to ingest the plants, to eat them, to cultivate them, to share the joys of your gardens with one another. I think that's the philosophy that we're trying to propose out there, sharing the joy, first of all, and then of our gardens, secondly. And then beyond that, like these days, we're really trying to pass the microphone around the community. We're working on a podcast to explore concepts of race, risk, and resilience, especially being what a lot of folks describe as the ground zero for climate change impacts and sea level rise. And when we consider effects of sea level rise, we're really concerned about the inundation of indigenous histories, archaeological sites in the land. So I think supporting historic preservation projects like Charmaine's, like the indigenous communities are working on, and being a good neighbor.
Ooh, yes, thank you. Wonderful. All right. And then, for once you get the easy one, Stephanie. How can people engage with the work of Joseph, Stella, and this beautiful exhibition?
Okay, it'll take me longer to turn on the microphone than to answer. Got it. Go see the exhibition.
Wonderful. Thank you again to each of our fabulous speakers this evening. We so appreciate your time and generosity. Thanks to each of you for making it out on this gloriously rainy evening. We appreciate each of you for the time you took, your attention, and your presence. If you'd like to hang out afterwards to talk to any of our guest speakers, we'll be here for just a couple more minutes. Otherwise, good night and thank you.